The future is a million little choices. Practice or play video games. 2 hours in the gym or 2 hours at the movies. A little extra work or a little extra play. Reconcile or let the sun go down on your anger. Get up or push the snooze button again. Take a potential client to the game or take a kid from a broken home. Spend that bonus on yourself or give it to a ministry that reaches out to pregnant teens. If we could get a picture of the future, if we could jump ahead 10, 15, 20 years, and see the accumulation of our decisions, the chain of events we set in motion, how differently would we live today? How would we choose to spend our time? What would we walk away from? How would we treat the people around us? What would we choose to pursue with passion? Where would we choose to invest our skills and our resources? Your future is a million little choices, and it starts today.
So what are you passionate about? Think about it. What are you passionate about? What drives you? What wakes you up in the morning? Because you see, I believe that we naturally gravitate towards whatever it is we're passionate about. That's what we spend our time on. That's what we spend our day doing. That's what we spend all of our free time in, what we're passionate about. So, again, what are you passionate about? Let me give you an exercise here that will help you maybe define some of that for you. I want you to imagine in your life, and some of you young kids, you won't even feel the pain that the adults are about to feel for just a moment. Actually, they're going to feel joy, but it's because of some pain. Imagine right now that you had everything in your life paid for. Your house, your car, everything was paid for. You owed nobody anything. Anybody excited about that thought? Yeah. Okay, so imagine that you're there, and imagine that you don't have a lot of need and a lot of want for things. And so now comes into your life an extra $2 million. You with me? All right, so you have $2 million, and you have no obligations for that $2 million. Where does it go? You don't have to answer out loud, just think about it. Where does it go? Because see, you got to be careful. I want you to answer that question honestly, but how you answer that question will reveal a lot about your passions. I was in a seminar, a real estate seminar, and they were asking people that very question, Robert, and it was funny because it was kind of sad because these younger than me, much younger than me. Now it's not hard to find people younger than me, but anyway, they were younger than me, and they would stand up. It's like I'm going to buy a Land Rover. I'm like, awesome. That doesn't get me up in the morning. Someone else said, I would buy a 10,000 square foot house. Okay, that doesn't get me up in the morning either. I knew the answer to this because we had just returned from Roatan, but I looked at Charlotte and I said, what would you do? Don't you love when you ask a question that you already know the answer to? And she didn't miss a beat. I'm so proud of her because she made me right. That was what was so cool about it. But I'd buy a whole bunch of uniforms for kids in Roatan, Honduras that can't go to school because they don't have uniforms. That will get you up in the morning, right? That'll get you up in the morning. So what are you passionate about? What drives you? What do you spend your time doing? Because God is calling us, to be passionate servants. We've been talking about what the anatomy of a servant. What's it look like to be a servant? The first thing we talked about was you got to be available. You've got to be willing to be a servant. You've got to be, your time is not your time, that you're willing, when something comes up, you're willing to serve. You're willing to help. You're willing to meet a need. Then we talked about you got to be teachable. And that one's tough. I don't know, anybody still struggling with teachable? Because that means we got to admit, I may not be on the right path, or I might have a wrong opinion, and I got to change that opinion just like Esther did. And I have to be willing to be teachable. Then last week we talked about being faithful and loyal to people and to God. And we talked about how being faithful doesn't make you closer to God, but being faithful reveals whether or not you're close to God. I mean, it's that if you are following God, you will naturally serve Jesus and you will naturally share Jesus with other people. It's a byproduct of that following. And today we're going to dive into this and unpack this idea as we continue to look at Esther. We're going to dive into this idea of what it means to be passionate as a servant. As you see, a servant is not just available and teachable and faithful, but a servant is passionate. But what we're passionate about determines whether, if, and how effective we can be when we serve. John Piper says this. He says, "The human heart hates a vacuum. We never merely leave God because we value Him little. We always exchange God for what we value more. This is the more foundational meaning of sin, exchanging the glory of the immortal God for substitutes, anything we value more than God." There's another word for that, it's called idolatry. And as we figure out or try to look at what we're passionate about, we begin to understand that if we are valuing anything more than God, then we have let that become an idol. By the way, I probably won't get to this later, so let me just give you, I'm reading a book by Jefferson Bethke called Jesus is Greater Than Religion. You need to get this book. It's an incredible book. Jesus is the greater sign, greater than religion. But in that book, he talks about idols, and he talks about what it means to have idols, and he says, you want to know what you idolize? What do you demonize? Because whatever you idolize, you will demonize the opposite of that. I'm going to step on some toes for just a minute. Because he says, Jefferson Bethke says this, you can get mad at me because I believe it, but he said it first. He said, if you're demonizing someone of another political party, it probably means that you've idolized politics just a little bit too much. Because if we idolize God, what's the opposite of God? Evil, Satan, demon, sin. That's what we demonize. And if we are on that, then we are probably putting God where He needs to be. So idolatry, it's an incredible thing. Anything we value more than God. So we look at Esther. We're going to read some of Esther today. I hope you know the story. I'm going to try to walk you along through the parts that we're looking at today. I don't know about you, but I've listened to Esther as I've walked probably 20 times in the last 3 weeks. It's an incredible thing to just keep pouring that story into your mind. But Esther became queen. I hope you're with me on this. But Esther in the book became queen. And she became queen, I'm calling it in quotes, by the harem process. And if you don't know that story, go read it. But it's because King Xerxes had abandoned his Queen Vashti. And so he went through and got all the young virgins, and he ended up picking Esther as his queen. But Haman, this man who was part of the Persian Empire, Haman had become second in command to King Xerxes. He had been elevated there, but he also was a how do I say it? I'm trying to say it nicely. He wasn't a very nice man because he was selfish. He wanted people to bow down to him. And everyone bowed down to him because the king commanded it, except for Mordecai. Mordecai, who was Esther's cousin, who had raised her like his daughter, wouldn't bow down. And so Haman was just filled with this rage because of what had happened. Because Mordecai wouldn't bow down to him. And so because this happened, Haman wanted to not only kill Mordecai, he wanted to annihilate the Jews who Mordecai was a part of. And so he went in and he began to beg the king to not just annihilate Mordecai, but annihilate all the Jews. Listen to this. This is an interesting fact. Haman went in to bribe the king with 10,000 talents of silver. Now, I don't know, that means nothing probably to us today. Let me tell you what 10,000 talents of silver is. It is 750,000 pounds of silver. process. Silver's cheap, but that's a lot of silver. As a matter of fact, in today's age, and who knows where the market was when this stat was written down, it would be the equivalent of $153 million today. That's how much rage Haman was filled with and wanted to destroy the Jews. He was willing to go in and bribe the king with this money so that he could kill all them. The king agrees, and he signs an irrevocable decree that all the Jews in the 12th month, they were fair game, that people could kill them. So, what should we be passionate about? There's where we pick up the story. But what should we be passionate about? What should we be passionate about if we're going to be a servant? You see, we've got to be faithful to God. We've got to be passionate to God. We talked about that a little bit last week. We will serve. But if what we are passionate about determines if and how we serve, what can we learn from Esther and from this story about what we should be passionate about? Well, the first thing I believe that we have to be passionate about is we must grieve for people's condition and for their future. Now, I could have said that with one word. What are you supposed to be passionate about? People. We should grieve for people's condition and their future. Now, I know this sounds tough because we want to go around, we want to be happy, we want to be joyful. But you look around and there's people all around us hurting, and there's people all around us with great need. And I think sometimes we look around, well, they shouldn't have done that. That's how they got there. And instead of having this passion, this grieving that comes in us because of people and their condition, and if it's not about their need that they have, it's about the lostness because they don't have Jesus. When you see someone who is stuck in sin, when you see someone who is sinning in a way that you believe is against God, do you see someone who you can say, I can't believe that? Or do you see their sin? Or do you grieve in your heart because if they die in that position, they're lost? If they die in that position, then they don't get to go to heaven and be with God. We've got to develop a grief. And I don't have time to develop this completely, but I think we come at this, we miss this from two sides. Sometimes we don't grieve because we don't call sin sin. Sometimes we don't grieve because we look and we go, you know what, it's okay, they can do whatever they want. God is gracious, it's no big deal. But sometimes we don't grieve because we're judgmental and because we look down on people because they sin differently than we do. But we've got to develop this passion in our heart for people. In Esther chapter 4, we see how Mordecai and Esther, how they grieved for people because they're people, the Jews. Remember, there's 127 provinces in Persia, from India to Egypt. This is a huge, Assyria and Persia was gigantic. And there were Jews all throughout that, and every one of them was going to die. We pick up in chapter 4, it says this. When Mordecai learned all that had been done, this plot to kill, Mordecai tore his clothes and he put on sackcloth and ashes. And he went out into the midst of the city. And he cried out with a loud and bitter cry. And he went up to the entrance of the king's gate, for no one was allowed to enter the king's gate clothed in sackcloth. And in every province, wherever the king's command and his decree reached, there was great mourning among the Jews, with fasting and weeping and lamenting. And many of them lay in sackcloth and ashes. When Esther's young women and her eunuchs came and told her, the queen was deeply distressed. And she sent garments to clothe Mordecai so that he might take off his sackcloth, but he would not accept them. And then Esther called for Hathach, one of the king's eunuchs, who had been appointed to attend her, and ordered him to go to Mordecai to learn what this was and why it was. You see, Mordecai was passionate about the Jews. He was passionate about their situation. He mourned publicly. He put on sackcloth and ashes, and he cried aloud and bitterly. He was ticked off because of what was going to happen to his people. He couldn't be consoled. The Jews grieved as if they were already dead, and according to Haman's decree that was irrevocable, in essence, they were dead. It just hadn't happened yet. It was decreed to be in the future. And this kind of grief for people and for their condition and their future without Jesus, that's the kind of passion that moves us to serve others and to share Jesus with others. If we have that kind of passion for people, if we have that kind of grief for people, do you think it'll change how we address their sin? Do you think it'll change how we talk to people about where they're at if we have that kind of grief and passion? Because I'll just be honest with you. If all we're going to do is sit up on the pulpit and we're going to just sit and beat people over the head, I can sit up here and tell you that this person's doing wrong and this person's doing wrong, and I think it's ironic that we'll go out and we'll picket against sins that we don't like, but nobody pickets in front of Golden Corral. Right? We'll get all bent out of shape because somebody says a word that is offensive to us. And don't get me wrong, guys. The Word of God's pretty clear about how we're supposed to speak. But no one's out in front of KFC going, you shouldn't be eating that fried stuff or that high fructose corn syrup. I've stood up here overweight and railed against sin. Guys, if we're passionate for the lostness of people, it will change how we talk to people. If we really grieve over where they're at. Esther was deeply distressed. Haman, on the other hand, was passionate enough to spend lots of money to destroy these people because Mordecai made him look bad. See, the opposite of grieving for people is self-focus. Actually, what it is indifference caused by self-focus. See, it's not hatred. Hatred still involves passion. I think we've created this incredible indifference towards people who are different than us. I don't care. If they don't figure it out like I figured it out, then I'm going to throw my hands up in the air and I'm not going to do anything. But God calls me to be passionately grieving for people who are lost without Jesus Christ. Amen? And so God calls us to do that. Let me ask you this. There are people all over the world today who will die today for lack of food and clean water. Does that bother you? All over the world today, there are people who will die for lack of food and clean water. In Roatan, Honduras, 3 or 4 days ago, an infant baby was born on a trash heap. What do we have to complain about? Not only was she born on that trash heap, she will be raised on that trash heap because it's the only place that they can go. That's the only place they can afford to have a house. It's at the dump. Children in our country, children in our state, children in our city will go to bed hungry tonight or without a home tonight. Does that bother you? Hatred or indifference continues in our country for people who look different than us, for people who think different than us, for people who sin different than us. And a servant of God only responds and reacts when we have a grief in our heart for people, for their condition, for their future, for their need. I understand there's a lot of things to be afraid of in this world. I got that. I understand that. But at any of the points that I'm trying to protect my family, or at any of the points that I'm trying to do the right thing, I better have some grief in there for people who are lost without Jesus, for people who have needs that I can help meet. And I better find that compassion that's driven by my passion. Many people today, listen to this, many people today will die without a relationship with Jesus Christ. Today, they will die. Does that bring any grief to you? And does it bring enough grief to you that it makes you forget and quit worrying about the stuff that maybe you came in bothered about today? You see, Esther was initially concerned about her own life, wasn't she? She said, I can't go into the king. If I go into the king, that no one goes into the king unless the king invites them to come in. And if he doesn't put his scepter out to me, I'll die. So she was concerned about her own life, but Mordecai began to convince her that no, she needs, that her life wasn't worth more than the entire Jewish population. And so she ends her, after telling them to fast for her, she ends saying, if I perish, I'll perish, but I will go. And that's the kind of passion that a servant of God has. Guys, I understand that what I'm saying to you is a great sermon to empty churches. I got that. I understand that what I'm telling you right now is a great way to say, well, I don't want any of that. But you know what? I think you probably should appreciate the fact that I'm not standing up here telling you that God's going to give you everything you ask for and that you're going to get rich and that you don't have to ever serve anybody and that your life's going to be great and you're never going to get sick. If you want, there's other churches you can go to and you can hear that message, but what I'm trying to tell you today is God calls me and He calls you to be passionate about people so that I will serve them, so that they will turn their hearts toward Jesus Christ. And that's the message we will always preach. That we have to turn to Him. Jefferson Bethke, again in his book, he says this: religious people kill for what they believe. Jesus followers die for what they believe. Are you that passionate? Are you willing to die for what you believe? Galatians 2:20, we've been reading it this week. Paul says this: I have been crucified with Christ, and I no longer live, but Christ lives in me. The life I now live in the body, I live by faith in the Son of God who loved me and gave Himself for me. It's not about me, it's about Jesus. And if it's about Jesus, it's about I love who He loves, and I serve who He serves, and I reach out to who He wants me to reach out to. There's a beautiful picture of a relationship we have with God, the King, and that through Jesus' death we have access to the throne room and to the King. You understand that if we go approach the throne, we go approach the King, He should probably kill us too because of our sin. But because of what Jesus did, Jesus, the cross was that golden scepter that was extended to you and to me. Because He was passionate for you and me. And we can go and we can beg on our knees and plead with the King for our lives and for the lives and the souls of those doomed for destruction. So I got to be passionate about people. I got to grieve about people's condition, their future. Well, what happens if you aren't passionate for people? See, if you spend your time against or indifferent towards other people, instead of being passionate and filled with compassion for them, their condition and their future, eventually you will become so self-focused like Haman that your entire life will be about fulfilling your mission, about building your kingdom, and you will encounter humiliation and demotion, and the demotion you feared the most. Did you catch that? Let me just say it simply. If we don't love people and grieve for people, what's going to happen is we're going to become so self-focused, we'll spend all our time building our kingdom instead of focused on God's kingdom. And that's the second part you need to understand. You need to be passionate about God's kingdom. We must work to build God's kingdom instead of ours. We must work to build God's kingdom instead of ours. I've said this to you before, but I want to say it to you again, and you need to hear me explain it. God does not have a plan for your life. Jeremiah 29:11 was not written so that you could go around saying, I get to be prosperous. Now, let me explain just a little bit, because I do believe God does have a plan for your life. But the problem is, we keep looking for God's plan of the things I want to have happen. The person I marry, the job that I'm supposed to take, whether or not we keep looking for God's blessings in His plan. Here's what I believe. I believe God has a plan. You with me? Do you believe God has a plan? God has a plan, but that plan is all centered around His kingdom, not yours. And so, if God has a plan for your life, it's the role or the part you play in His plan, right? It's the role, the service that you play in making His kingdom, in making His glory be the one that's above all else. And so we got to be careful when we go in and start interpreting verses like that, because we start to think, oh, that means I'm going to get a great job, I'm going to make lots of money, I'm going to do all this. And maybe God is going to let you do that. But if He does, listen to me, if He does, and you're part of His plan, He wants you to use that money and those gifts and all the things that He gives you so that you can continue to make His plan come to fruition. I got to be focused, I got to be passionate about God's kingdom, not mine. She was passionate and she risked everything. She risked her life. Mordecai convinced Esther that she had to do something, and her passion for the people caused her to become passionate about the mission. She had a mission. She was more passionate about people and the mission than she was about her own survival. If I perish, I perish. And this kind of passion, guys, will move people towards God. Let that sink in. You're willing to do anything for someone. You're willing to die for someone. You think that'll move them toward, they'll want to know what's going on in your life? If all we're doing is telling people what they're doing wrong, if all we're doing is pointing fingers at people, and we're not serving people, and we're up here building our kingdom, and then that's not going to turn anybody towards Jesus. But if we begin to passionately serve in the mission that God has given us, God's going to start pointing people towards Himself because of your service. People are going to go, wow, look at that person's willing to sacrifice everything for me. Haman was more concerned with what people thought of him, and how much money he had, and his career and his advancement, and how many sons he had. And that misguided passion made him oblivious, not only to the needs of others, but to his demise that was just around the corner. Because Haman eventually lost his life in our story. What are you passionate about? Because what you're passionate about determines what we do and what we say and how we serve, and ultimately determines what happens to us in the future. Esther threw a feast for the king and for Haman to reveal the plot to the king about the Jews. But she just invited them to another feast. Haman left the feast. He was joyful. He was glad of heart. But when he saw Mordecai, it stole his joy. And when he recounted all of his accomplishments, he said they were worth nothing to me so long as I see Mordecai sitting at the king's gate. One person stole his joy. He had all this stuff, and he could have used it to do great things. And instead, one person made him bitter and angry. So he built a gallows so he could hang Mordecai on it. So he could go ask the king to hang Mordecai on it. Well, he went to the palace to ask the king, can I hang Mordecai on this? He's not bound down to me. He's not doing what you said. I want to hang him on this gallows. But instead, the king remembered. Overnight he couldn't sleep. He remembered what Mordecai had done to save his life, and he decided to honor him. And he looked out in the outer court and he goes, hey, who's out there? Oh, it's Haman. Hey, Haman, come here. This is the best part of the story. Anybody enjoy this part of the story? Hey, Haman, come here. Haman comes in and he goes, what should the king do to someone he wants to honor? And Haman's thinking, well, there's nobody he wants to honor more than me. See what happens when you're self-focused? I think, what would you do if someone said, I want to honor you, so what do you want me to do? I mean, that's what he was thinking. So he goes, if you're self-focused, I think you should get the best king's horse. And you should put him on the best king's horse. You should put the king's robe on him. And you should have someone pull him around. Say, I want someone to serve me. So I want someone to pull me around. I'm inserted. He didn't say it this way. Pull me around town and say, this is what the king does for someone he wants to honor. And the king turned around and goes, all right, go get Mordecai and you do that for him. Yeah. See, when we're worried about building our kingdom, we get humiliated. But when we're worried about building God's kingdom, God exalts us. But He doesn't exalt us so that we'll be exalted. He exalts us so that we can point people to Jesus. And we do that by getting down on our knees and serving them. Does this all make sense? We're passionate about people, and we're passionate about the kingdom. We're passionate about His kingdom, not our kingdom. See, you can willingly choose to serve others passionately with a servant's heart, and you will serve with joy, and you will serve with gladness. Or you can try to gain everything for yourself and try to get everyone to pay attention to you, and eventually you will end up serving begrudgingly the very people you were trying to elevate yourself above. So Esther spoke on her behalf, but mostly on her own behalf, but she also spoke on behalf of her people. Because her passion was to save her people. And you've got to develop that kind of passion for people and for God's kingdom so that you'll serve them and point them towards the salvation that they can find in Jesus Christ. If you're passionate about your own mission instead of God's, this will eventually lead to your destruction. So, who's the most or the greatest example of this? This is a Sunday school answer. Who's the greatest example of what I'm describing? Passion and compassion. Jesus. Jesus is the one that showed His passion, His compassion for you when He went to the cross. Now, I don't want you, very briefly, I want you to just think about the fact, I won't tell you to think about your sin. Just think about the fact that anyone in here think they can stand before God and say, I've never sinned? We're all on the same page, right? We all got this, right? We understand. Jesus knew that. He knew the sins that you have done. He knew before He went to the cross the sins you haven't committed yet. He already saw them. But His passion and His compassion for you was so great that He went to the cross just for you. And if you're the only one who turns your heart towards Jesus, He did it just for you. That's an incredible passion. If we got what we deserved, but we didn't. And that's the kind of passion that He wants you and me to have for others and for His kingdom. Jefferson Bethke goes on to say this: the issue isn't whether someone is good or bad, but whether he is repentant or unrepentant. Who is God of her life? Who's in control? What or who are they pursuing? Are they looking to Him or trusting in self? Because I trust that if Jesus' grace has radically collided with a heart, I believe that person will begin to align themselves with Jesus' image, looking more like Him every day. If Jesus' grace has collided with your heart, you can't help but serve. You will be filled with compassion because He had compassion for you. You will be filled with passion for people because He has passion for you. You will be filled with passion for His kingdom instead of yours because that's the example that Jesus set for us. If His grace has collided with your heart, you'll look like Jesus. And that brings us to the main point I want you to leave today with, and that's this: if we are passionate about people, and we are passionate about God and His mission, His kingdom, we cannot help but serve others. That looks a lot like Jesus, doesn't it? If we're passionate about people and we're passionate about His kingdom and His mission, we can't help but serve others. And so here's your response. Here's what I want you to do this week. I want you to intentionally choose someone in your life that you would say maybe has been against you. This one's going to hurt just more than fasting, by the way. I want you to look into your life and I want you to choose someone who has hurt you. I want you to choose someone who thinks differently than you. I want you to choose someone who looks different than you, who acts different than you, who sins different than you. And I want you to intentionally serve them. Ouch, right? I want you to choose, I guess you could use the word, I don't want you to make them this in your life, but someone you might call your enemy. At least for this moment they might be. And I want you to choose to serve them. I want you to do something for them. One thing, two things, I don't know. Let the Spirit of God lead you in that. Because guys, we can come in here every week and we can sing songs and I can get up and I can tell you and I can challenge you and you can go, man, that was hard, Nathan, that's hard. And we can walk out and do absolutely nothing and nothing changes. And God says, I want you to grow. I want you to move. Part of our stuff is that you become something, that you grow in your life and you grow in your spirit, and that God is moving us to not just hear these words and go, that's really awesome and I'll see you next Sunday. But that we go and we do something. There was a lady who grew up in a really bad home. And growing up in that home, she ended up getting pregnant, and she's going to tell you her own story, but she ended up getting pregnant and she ended up going into a lifestyle that we would probably point a finger at. And God redeemed her. But instead of going, well, she still goes to the church, but instead of spending all her time at the church, she has chosen to go back to that life that she used to live and try to rescue those people and to serve those girls who are in a lifestyle that is ruining their life. And it's exactly what God is calling us to. It's great if we teach a Sunday school class in this church, but God really wants you to go out there and He wants you to minister to people in prisons. He wants you to minister to people on the streets. He wants you to minister to people in places where the enemy is winning the battle. And so watch this, but as you watch this, think about what God wants you to do to follow Him.
I was born with a teen mother. She was 17 when she had me, and so it was a definite struggle for her. I was definitely not the popular girl at all and very picked on for not having money or the neighborhood that I lived in. And so I was really insecure and very vulnerable. And so what happened is when I was 14, I was raped. And that seemed to make a big change in me immediately. In my mind, I thought, it was taken from me and now I'm gonna be in control. So I became very promiscuous from 14 on. And then eventually I ended up pregnant at 17, so in big trouble. And I think in my heart, I never wanted to have my son experience the financial hardship that I did. And so I got a job as a go-go dancer. And then about 6 months later, I got a job as a bikini dancer. So it was like Satan really knew how to do it just the right way for me. Let's go from go-go dancing to bikini dancing to pasty to topless, and then eventually I was a full nude dancer. The more the clothing came off, the more money I made. So it definitely kept inspiring me to go further every time. My lifestyle reflected how I felt about myself. I treated myself like I was trash. I was drinking and partying and doing all of that. There were times that I would wake up stinking of alcohol, still drunk. I never saw myself as smart or funny or anything. The only thing I could see in myself was the outside. That's it. Honestly, I thought, I have a ticket to hell. Like, I am not making it to heaven. I didn't want to pay the price for the life I was living. I genuinely was nervous. I was sitting out at a coffee shop, and there were these girls, and they were talking to everybody about the church they went to, and they were inviting everyone to their church. I knew I needed to find a church. So I was like, I think I'm gonna go to their church. Like, they look cool. Well, they took one look at me and passed me over. They went to every person but me. And it makes me sad because they didn't know how much I wanted that God that they had, and so it still hurts me to this day, that people passed me by. So that was the time. And the amazing thing is when I arrived at that church, the second my foot touched the carpet, I had tears streaming down my face, and I knew I was never gonna leave God. I ended up giving my life full-blown to God, and I turned my back on that world 100%. When I read the Bible, I know, this is real. This is for us right now. This is so current. And I realized, somebody needed to start reaching out to the girls. It started with me praying to God and asking Him, what do you want me to do? And that's when ideas started to come to me. It's kind of a welcoming mat to Christianity. It's actually a very simple ministry. We go into the strip club and we bring in gifts, food, flowers, homemade cards, and we set up in their dressing room kind of a mini party. And on their gift it says, "We love you just the way you are," with the church name, and then they can either contact me directly or they know that they're welcome to come to that church just the way they are. I want them to come right where they're at. If they're dancing, they're dancing. If they're whatever they're doing right then, they could come right then, because I don't know anyone who would give up a job for a God they don't know. They don't know that He loves them. They only know one thing, and that is that the outside of them is good. They don't know the inside's good. So it's actually been the biggest challenge of the ministry is not the sex industry. Never has been. Never even kind of has been. My challenge has been to have the church open their heart to let the people in. To let them come in how they are, not to pick them apart and try to transform them faster than God, but just to allow God to come into their heart and to give them the time to change.